When I was growing up in the American South, everyone in every family I knew, save maybe one or two, went to church somewhere, or maintained some practice of faith, in some fashion at least. To meet a family of atheists then was rare, but these days it's increasingly the opposite. Faith in the divine is considered primitive and superstitious at best, and dangerously diluted at worst. This isn't just apparent in the home, but also in messaging from the state and the educational system, popular culture, corporate media, and so on. People who express any reservation at all at upending millennia-old standards in favor of untested new dynamics in society, culture, medicine, identity, and so on are ostracized, demonized, and sometimes even threatened, jailed, or otherwise abused by the system and its supportive mob. Instead of a means of asking questions of the universe to understand it better, science became a means of turning certain beliefs into facts and imposing false realities through force or coercion. In the last few years, we've heard various statements like, "We own the science," "I am the science," and "the science is settled," which are all antithetical to the very concept of scientific inquiry. We're told to put our trust in science and to commit our lives and our well-beings into the care of elitist experts who can interpret the science for us lowly peasants. But their starry-eyed obsession with technocracy belies a barely veiled penchant for fascism, and their own words demonstrate both a pathological desire to assert their beliefs above everyone else's and an inability to think beyond their self-reinforcing dogma. Because the science we hear about today isn't the science of the scientific method, of unbiased curiosity and empirical evidence. Most of the science humanity is concerned with today isn't conducted to discover unknown truths, but to justify predetermined outcomes. And unfortunately, those outcomes often serve to make profits for enormous corporations like pharmaceutical companies, industrial agriculture, and so on. Biased science is bad enough, but then because the results are worth money, typically millions or even billions, there is also plenty of motivation to lobby, bribe, and defraud the government and consumers, and to censor any opposition that arises. But it's not just wealth that drives this anti-scientific pathology. Ironically, it's the belief in science and technology as the measure of humanity, plus an inflamed savior complex that turns trust into faith in science. The belief that humanity can improve itself, not even just its circumstances, but actually the essence of what we are, all on our own without the aid of divinity, is at the core of this ambition, as is the fallacy that our imperfect human nature could conceive of a more perfect universe than already exists. Westerners are sold on the myth of what Charles Eisenstein refers to as the ascent of humanity, that we have always moved from a state of less technological complexity to more. That is to say that the future is always brighter than the past, and humanity will be more knowledgeable and capable tomorrow than we were yesterday. But this faith in technology is based on nothing more concrete than belief, on an oversimplified understanding of history and an irrational obsession with technology. The extreme hubris implied by this framework of mind rivals the tragic potential of a Greek myth, and it can rightly be described as faith, in the religious sense. Rather than being based on empirical evidence, what we consider to be scientific knowledge today contains an unacceptably high degree of irreproducibility. That is to say, we don't really know what of our science is actually, empirically, self-evidently true. Therefore, trusting the science is a matter of faith. So what is meant when science is invoked today is religious convention rather than empiricism. But what religion rules in the increasingly atheistic West? Well, that's what we're going to explore in this series, the religion of science. What happened to science, how it got this bad, who benefits from the situation, and how we've shifted from empiricism to fanaticism, to the belief that our technology should and must outpace our humanity, to save humanity. In part one, we'll reveal just how bad things have gotten in the scientific world, taking an honest look at just how irrational the rational sciences have become. And in part two, we'll name this demon, discover its origins, and find ways to exorcise it. Stay tuned. The first half of this series begins in just a moment. Welcome to the 16th episode of the Postmugglism podcast, The Religion of Science. I'm your host, Nate. Thanks for tuning in. This show is all about magic and magical thinking in the postmodern age, about practical enchantments and spells of optimism for interesting times. In this episode, part 1 of 2 in this series, I'm going to attempt to explain the strange shift in Western values around science, technology, and social order, as a result of a rising obsession with technocracy, thinly veiled as an urgent attempt to save our species. I'll demonstrate exactly how science is corrupted, who benefits, and what kind of damage is being done. And I'll lay the groundwork for the revelations of part 2 of this series, where we trace the origins of this cult of science and identify its inspirations, aspirations, and its true believers. Before I get started, please take a moment to subscribe to my show, but more importantly, also to my email newsletter so that you get notified whenever I publish new content like videos, podcast episodes, articles, and more. Sign up now at www.postmugglism.com. While the point of this episode is fairly straightforward, to show how futurism co-opted science with quasi-religious dogma, this episode's purpose is not only to warn of the dangers, but to present an alternative way of being which makes space for new, emergent possibilities. To tell this story, I first need to peel back the veil that obscures the true nature of our scientific and technological institutions, to deconstruct the delusional idea that anything referred to as science is either empirically proven or unquestionably true. And, as always, links to sources for everything I mentioned in this episode can be found in the show notes. A 2005 article by the meta-scientist John Ioannidis carried the dramatic title, "Why Most Published Research Findings Are False," and its mathematical model concluded just that. Once you consider the many ways scientific studies can go wrong, any claim in a scientific paper is more likely to be false than true. Stuart Ritchie, Science Fictions. The way that science is presented in school or in the news would make you believe that it is a canon of fixed knowledge, of facts which have been proven reliably true. We preach the value of empirical knowledge, discount subjective experience, and deny the existence of non-physical realities. We do this and call it rationalism, and any views to the contrary are naturally considered irrational. Unfortunately, much like history, science is largely written by the victor, meaning that science is determined by scientists that both receive grants and generate statistically significant results, which can be published. Science which is paid for is inevitably inclined towards a bias which yields the results desired by whoever is funding the experiment. And even if there is no outright fraud committed, results that might risk future funding are far less likely to be submitted for publishing. In the modern scientific community, the results of experiments conducted by an individual researcher are shared among the larger community through the peer review process and a network of industry publications known as journals. Unless retracted at some point, inclusion in one of these exclusive, highly respected journals signifies that a researcher's work has been included in the scientific canon for their respective field. There are over 30,000 of such journals actively publishing research across all fields and industries. Inclusion in one of these journals is a formal, highly standardized process in which a researcher first performs their experiment, then documents their results, their method, and the actual details of the experiment. Then the results are interpreted through statistical analysis and presented as a paper to a journal for peer review. The journal will facilitate the review of the paper by soliciting a group of other qualified researchers working in relevant fields. Those who responded are almost certainly utilized, and also most likely added to a shortlist to be contacted for future requests. This weakens the peer review process significantly because it presents experts who work regularly with the journals the opportunity for personal gain, simply by signing off on the review process. Fraud of this sort, and much worse, is shockingly commonplace, and very little is being done to prevent it from being published. But as concerning as this kind of intentional fraud is, what may be even more alarming is the much more significant problem of unintentionally inaccurate or irreproducible results which, like their fraudulent counterparts, fly through the peer review process without raising any concerns. Within the scientific community, this phenomenon is referred to as the replication crisis, or reproducibility crisis alternatively, and is far more significant of a problem than the average person could possibly imagine. The book Science Fictions, How Fraud, Bias, Negligence, and Hype Undermine the Search for Truth, written by Stuart Ritchie, whose own work helped the scientific community to identify the problem of the replication crisis in the first place, details the enormity of the problem as well as the various contributing factors in layman's terms. Ritchie describes the situation starkly, and though the issue is particularly out of control in his own field of psychology, there is no field of scientific inquiry which does not experience the same lack of verifiability. Simply put, the replication or reproducibility crisis is caused by the scientific community's inability at large to reliably replicate the results of scientific experiments, which have generated accepted peer-reviewed literature and very often are the basis for changes in standards and procedures, in many cases to life-altering medical treatments. Ritchie implicated one of the most famous psychology experiments in history, known as the Stanford Prison Experiment. You've probably heard of it, where psychologist Philip Zimbardo split participants into two groups, guards and prisoners, and had them play these roles for a week in a simulated prison environment in the basement at Princeton University's psychology department. According to Zimbardo, the guards quickly began abusing the prisoners to the point that Zimbardo was forced to end the experiment early. This is the official story anyway, and the official takeaway was that good people in bad situations, particularly those involving power, will become more willing to do things they wouldn't otherwise because of the context. However, in 2019, researcher and filmmaker Thibault Letessier published a paper called Debunking the Stanford Prison Experiment, where he produced transcripts of tapes of Zimbardo coaching the guards and intervening in the experiment to produce specific results. This is extremely unfortunate because this experiment has influenced psychological thought and practice for decades, despite being essentially meaningless. Various startling examples like the Stanford Prison Experiment raised awareness among psychologists of the potential harm that fraudulent and inaccurate data might cause patients and the irreparable damage it might cause the reputation of the field in general. According to Ritchie, to get an idea of how bad things were, the psychologists started banding together to run large-scale replications of prominent studies across multiple different labs. The highest profile of these included a large consortium of scientists who chose 100 studies from 3 top psychology journals and tried to replicate them. The results, published in Science in 2015, made bitter reading. In the end, only 39% of the studies were judged to have replicated successfully. But it isn't just medical science that is affected. It's all science. A 2016 replication study of 18 microeconomic studies was only able to reproduce 61% of the studies. A study of functional brain imaging in 2018 found that standard studies where the brain's activity is recorded using MRI while the person is completing some kind of task were at best modestly replicable. Worse still, the functional brain imaging field was also rocked by a paper that revealed a statistical error in the software package commonly used to analyze imaging data, leading to a vast number of false positive results that compromised up to 10% of all studies ever published on the subject at that time. A massive replication project in 2020 found that the effects of ocean acidification, a consequence of climate change, had no effect on fish behavior, failing to replicate several highly publicized studies showing more acidic conditions cause fish to become disoriented and be more likely to swim towards the chemical cues produced by their predators rather than away from them. A reanalysis of 67 macroeconomic studies could only reproduce results from 22 of the studies using the original datasets. And according to Ritchie, scientists at the biotechnology company Amgen attempted to replicate 53 landmark preclinical cancer studies that had been published in top scientific journals. Preclinical studies are those done at an early stage of drug development, perhaps in mice or in human cells in vitro. A mere 6 of the replication attempts, that is just 11%, were successful. The results from similar attempts at another firm, Bayer, weren't much more impressive, at around 20%. Following that shocking study, Ritchie continues, in 2013 they formed an organized, collaborative attempt to replicate 51 important preclinical cancer studies in independent labs. But before the replicators could even begin, they hit a snag. In every single one of the original papers, for every single one of the experiments reported, there wasn't enough information provided for researchers to know how to rerun the experiment. Technical aspects of the studies, such as specific densities of cells that were used or other aspects of the measurements and analysis, simply weren't included. Replication attempts ran aground, prompting voluminous correspondence with the original scientists. Some were reluctant to collaborate. 45% were rated by the replicators as either minimally or not at all helpful. Perhaps they were worried that their replicators might not be competent, or that failures to replicate their results could mean that their future work wouldn't get funded. Later, a more comprehensive study took a random sample of 286 biomedical papers, including clinical trials, and found that all but one of them failed to report their full protocol. Another analysis found that 54% of biomedical studies didn't even fully describe what kind of animals, chemicals, or cells they used in their experiment. Scientific inquiry is messy and admittedly prone to mistakes, which is why protecting the scientific community from misinterpreted or illegitimate information should be a universal priority among all scientists and researchers, but we should know better than to indulge in this kind of idealism in the real world. Science, like every other field, is subject to the conditions of capitalism, and money talks. It's not like legitimate scientists get big paydays for producing convenient science that enables big corporations to profit obscenely, right? Well, I don't have evidence of that, at least in a widespread sense anyway. So perhaps we can hold on to the hope that this situation isn't as bad as all of that. But regardless, science costs money, and scientists have living expenses. And that money all has to come from somewhere. Grants pay for science, and either governments, corporations, or private special interests fund grants. And few, if any, of these institutions are interested in science for the sake of science alone. Just like anyone building a brand, scientists who want to be successful are motivated to only publish successful and significant results, so that their reputation earns them more work in the future. The habit of only announcing positive and significant results is referred to as publishing bias, and it isn't ideal for science as a practice because the lack of negative or neutral results provides little basis for comparison and greatly skews perception of what science really is among the community itself. Everybody likes a winner, especially organizations with a predetermined agenda that needs a particular outcome from the science that they fund. Research and development is an expensive proposition, and these types of studies are usually a critical step in getting government approval to take their products to market. There's almost always millions, and sometimes billions, on the line, and it would be naive to think that money doesn't change hands under the table with that much at stake. In addition to researchers playing favorites with the data that they publish, producing fraudulent data, or just skewing their analysis to create results favorable to their benefactors, the peer review process is vulnerable in its own right. There are fake peer review schemes which either involve predatory publications or Ponzi scheme-style networks of researchers and reviewers that generate a large quantity of illegitimate scientific literature. The paper Fake Peer Review and Inappropriate Authorship Are Real Evils by Horacio Rivera of Mexico's socialized medical system, EMIS, explains fake peer review scams in this way. Due to their direct monetary value in terms of better salaries and bonuses, publications have spawned the industry of academic article brokering and triggered novel ruses such as the FPR fake peer review scam. Using this sly strategy, some submitting authors suggest fake or sometimes real reviewers, but provide the editors with invented email addresses allowing the submitters to receive the invitation to review their own manuscripts. In a further elaboration, a peer circle is sometimes created to internally review the papers of each co-participant. Yet, it is likely that third-party agencies paid by the authors supply most of the fabricated reviewers and reviews. In the study, Rivera analyzes retractions of papers in journals around the world and determines that Iran, Korea, India, Pakistan, and China in particular, by a very significant margin, generate a disproportionate quantity of papers which were retracted for misusing a peer review process to get published by a scientific journal. Unfortunately, published scientific discoveries tend to transcend national borders, and inclusion in a scientific journal almost certainly puts your research in front of other professionals in your field, resulting in all kinds of negative downstream effects. Fraudulent science is hardly a fringe occurrence, or something that only happens in China. There are so many weak points in the standards of scientific research that fraud can be implemented at essentially every step of the process. Raw data can be falsified, methods can be biased, analysis can be skewed, results doctored, or simply fabricated, and the review process can be influenced in a variety of ways. It is so easy to fake studies that even the very biggest players regularly engage in highly illegal and highly profitable scientific fraud. One of the most popular techniques for faking chemical, biological, and medical research data involves fabricating blot tests, where some chemical material is applied to a reactive strip which reveals the presence of a particular protein or other compound by coloring the strip in a distinctive pattern. The tests are referred to as Western blots and are notoriously untrustworthy. How often do biologists fake the images in their papers? In 2016, the microbiologist Elizabeth Bick and her colleagues decided to find out. They searched 40 blog journals for papers that included Western blots, eventually finding 20,621. In a genuinely heroic set of analyses, Bick personally looked through every single one and checked for inappropriate duplication in its photographic images, What she found was enough to populate a gallery of dodgy scientific pictures several times over. In all, 3.8% of the published papers, around 1 in 25, included a problematic image. In a later analysis of papers from just one cell biology journal, Bick and her colleagues found an even higher percentage, 6.1%. Bick calculated that there are up to 35,000 papers in the literature that need to be retracted. When Bick and her team found a paper with faked images, they checked to see if other publications by the same author also had image duplications. This was true just under 40% of the time. Duplicating one image may be regarded as carelessness. Duplicating two looks like fraud. An expose from 2016 seems to implicate pharmaceutical giant Pfizer in just such a case of Western blot manipulation, which, when it comes to the drug business, represents clear and significant fraud. The author of the article describes the situation like this. In February 2016, I was contacted by a concerned scientist who told me about image irregularities in cancer research publications from the laboratories of Pfizer in La Jolla, California. The suspected irregularities this person reported ranged from duplicated Western blots to duplicated bands inside Western blots. The case was resolved by Pfizer admitting the Western blot images were fabricated, retracting 5 studies, and seemingly firing the lead researcher. Coincidentally, back in 2009, Pfizer was given the dubious honor of receiving the largest fine in U.S. history, a sum of $2.3 billion, for mispromoting the painkiller Bextra and paying doctors kickbacks for prescribing it incorrectly. Now that we've established that Pfizer has a clear and undeniable history of defrauding the government and their customers, people in pain, we shouldn't be naive and think that these cases were in any way isolated. After all, after receiving the biggest fine in history, they were caught cheating again in 2016, so clearly nothing changed. During the pandemic, Pfizer reported a record $100 billion in revenue in 2022 alone, and their version of the vaccine generated $38 billion of that total, almost 40% of their annual revenue. And they made roughly the same on the vaccine the year before as well. Chillingly, evidence indicates that Pfizer and their partner BioNTech falsified digital Western blot images in the studies they submitted to regulators around the world to fast-track their vaccine through the approval process. Investigative journalist Sonia Elijah delivered a presentation to the Spotlight Conference in Norway back in April, in which she presented compelling evidence that the digital blots were simply cut and paste over the results of all 4 test batches. Additionally, and the regulators were fully aware of this, there was a significant drop in the quality in RNA integrity to around only 55% between the test batches and the commercial batches produced for distribution. This means that only slightly over 50% of the RNA in the injections is actually the intended RNA sequence, and an alarming 45% are unidentified RNA fragments which express in some undocumented fashion. Most distressingly of all, regulators addressed the issue by lowering the required level of RNA integrity to 50%. Half of what's in Pfizer's shots is not the vaccine, but something else entirely. Sadly, fraud in scientific studies is not a victimless crime. Clearly, a great deal of money is wasted on illegitimate research, and retractions only prevent new people from being misled. They rarely make enough noise to re-educate everyone they originally misinformed. We can only imagine the terrible human cost of these errors because it depends entirely on how the information is used. The phenomena of new research, or better research, overturning old science in the medical field, along with a host of common treatments based on that bad science, is so common that it's been given a name: medical reversals. In 2019, a review of over 3,000 papers in 3 top medical journals found 396 studies which overturned the consensus on a medical practice. For example, due to studies indicating a planned cesarean section was the safest option for babies when a mother was giving birth to twins, this was standard practice for decades. However, a large randomized trial in 2013 showed that this procedure made no difference at all to the health of the children, and costs at least twice as much as a natural birth on average, as well as being harder on the mother's health in most situations. Likewise, some small trials found that cooling a cardiac arrest patient down by a few degrees increased the likelihood of their survival, and this advice was included in guidelines for paramedics for years, but a big study in 2014 showed that it either made no difference at all or may even have increased the likelihood of a second heart attack. Also, due to research from smaller studies, it was believed that the best thing to do in the days after someone has a stroke is to help them get moving as soon as possible. This concept is called early mobilization and appears in many widely used hospital guidelines. A large-scale randomized trial in 2015, however, showed that early mobilization instead led to poorer outcomes for the stroke patients. Another study from 2016 showed that the standard practice of giving stroke patients a platelet transfusion to replenish the blood cells involved in clotting also made things worse. Ritchie summarizes this shocking reality by saying, "The extent of the uncertainty in medical science can be fully appreciated if we take a look across the whole literature. One way of doing so is to consult all the many comprehensive reviews published by Cochrane Collaboration, a highly reputable charity that systematically assesses the quality of medical treatments. Of those, a startling 45% conclude that there's insufficient evidence to decide whether the treatment in question works or not. 45% of the accepted treatments reviewed do not have sufficient evidence to support their continued use. And in each case, thousands, and perhaps millions of patients have been treated, at least in part, incorrectly. We can assume that errors of this level of magnitude have a tragically high human cost. For a fresh and dramatic example, we need only look to the latest pharmaceutical frontier, vaccines produced during the 2020 to 2023 pandemic, and the voluminous cases of related injuries which have been reported, to say nothing of the unreported cases. The website openvaers.com tracks and analyzes the data voluntarily reported by the public in the U.S. government's Vaccine Adverse Event Reaction System, or VAERS. To demonstrate the severity of the potential consequences of Pfizer and other drug manufacturers' shoddy and potentially fraudulent science, I'll review a few of the more incredible findings that have emerged from this data since the treatments were introduced in late 2020. We can reasonably infer that if Pfizer's commercial injections had only 55% RNA integrity, that the remaining 45% of the material in the shots could be expressing proteins which yield unexpected complications, aka adverse events in pandemic parlance. There could be other factors that are responsible, of course, but it would be negligent to ignore the likelihood that delivering an equal dose of fragmentary RNA scraps as the fully formed RNA sequence in the shots might directly result in adverse events, of which there are a staggering number to consider. Let's start with the most clear-cut example, deaths associated with adverse events. The numbers are stark. In all reported years prior to 2021, the vaccine was released in December of 2020, the number of deaths reported to VAERS was less than 1,000 annually. In 2021, it was 22,263. In 2022, it was 12,448, and in 2023, it was way down again to 1,838 so far. It's unavoidable to conclude that this rise directly relates to the introduction of the novel mRNA injections approved for emergency use on bad and potentially fraudulent data during the 2020 to 2023 pandemic. Immediate death was a result in the majority of those 22,000 reports, but the volume of other debilitating or life-threatening reactions increases these figures by several orders of magnitude. And in each case, it is very obvious that the extreme majority of these cases took place during the pandemic response period of late 2020 through now in 2023. And it must be stressed that, by any estimate, VAERS receives reports on a tiny fraction of the total number of adverse events globally. Over 200,000 hospitalizations were reported after receiving an injection, and Pfizer shots represent a hugely disproportionate 68%, or 136,712 of those reports. There are 10,488 reports of anaphylaxis, a life-threateningly severe allergic reaction, and an additional 42,463 reports of severe allergic reactions, which required interventions but were not immediately life-threatening. Pfizer represents 77% of those cases. Reports of Bell's palsy number 17,048, and Pfizer represents 74% of those cases. Guillain-Barré reported cases total 4,874, and Pfizer generated 62% of them. Reported heart attacks after the injection number 19,915, and Pfizer represents 69% of those instances. All in all, there were 37,785 reports of life-threatening adverse events, and Pfizer doses contributed 68% of those reports. According to Statista, Pfizer and Moderna were the leading two vaccines administered, and around 366.9 million doses were Pfizer's, and 232.1 million were Moderna's versions, and other suppliers represented a relatively insignificant percentage between them. So it's not surprising to see Pfizer shots appearing in the VAERS data in large numbers. But then we should also see Moderna appearing in proportionate quantities. And we do not. The Pfizer numbers tend to be at least 3 times higher than Moderna, whose vaccine was administered at roughly 2/3 the rate of Pfizer's. The results from all the mRNA shots are questionable, and the methods of their creation and administration universally concerning. It seems obvious that Pfizer's drug was rushed into production despite obvious quality issues by using fraudulent scientific data and with preferential treatment by regulators, and that many, many more people were harmed as a result than would have been the case if science was actually respected and typical scientific rigor was applied. A study from Johns Hopkins in 2018 showed that medical errors claim over 250,000 lives in the U.S. each year, and some estimates put the figure at almost double. Yes, there are tens of millions of hospital visits which do not result in death or serious injury each year, much like well over 90% of all scientific papers do not involve detectable fraud. But there have to be big problems in scientific convention to allow even small amounts of such glaring and destructive chicanery as we've examined in this episode. And that's just a small percentage of intentional fraud. What about the not insignificant at all percentage of well-intentioned science that cannot be replicated? And what about all the other science that we believe we orient our lives around and we're pinning the future of humanity on? How much of it is based on flimsy, biased, and generally untrustworthy science? Once you start looking, you'll find corrupt science everywhere, in essentially every aspect and area of our lives. The products we use, the food and energy we consume, the way that we're asked to live our lives at a very deep level is all fed to us through narratives based on science, produced by a very untrustworthy system. But some topics are particularly fraught with minefields of pseudoscientific dogma like green or renewable energy, net zero and carbon sequestration, and the emerging field of counter-disinformation. These topics can provide examples beyond medicine and the biological sciences, which demonstrate how vulnerable to delusion and corruption all of materialist science has become. And in addition, these topics, which have a longer fuse, tend to reveal certain truths that can be obscured by our immediate fears in the areas of health and medicine. When it comes to climate change or renewable energy or misinformation, etc., these effects take place over the long term, and it's easier to slow down and examine their veracity. There is, as of yet, no such thing as a sustainable source of energy. Renewable, perhaps, because sources of energy like the wind and the sun do not diminish because of our use, but sustainable they are not, because the means of converting their power into energy always requires resources which are themselves neither renewable or sustainable. An article in Nature magazine in 2021 entitled "Lithium-ion Batteries Need to Be Greener and More Ethical" sums up the problem like this. Lithium-ion technology has downsides for people and the planet. Extracting the raw materials, mainly lithium and cobalt, requires large quantities of energy and water. Moreover, the work takes place in mines where workers, including children as young as 7, often face unsafe conditions. Let's be very clear on this point. Lithium batteries are produced by slave labor. The conditions are dangerous, frequently fatal, and entirely unregulated. The majority of lithium on the market today comes from the DRC, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, and a recent article from NPR entitled "How Modern-Day Slavery in the Congo Powers the Rechargeable Battery Economy" details the conditions of the lithium mines in the DRC in shocking detail. You have to imagine walking around some of these mining areas and dialing back our clock centuries. People are working in subhuman, grinding, degrading conditions. They use pickaxes, shovels, stretches of rebar to hack and scrounge at the earth in trenches and pits and tunnels to gather cobalt and feed it up the formal supply chain. The mining industry has ravaged the landscape of the DRC. Millions of trees have been cut down. The air around the mines is hazy with dust and grit, and the water has been contaminated with toxic effluents from the mining processing. What's more, cobalt is toxic to touch and breathe, and there are hundreds of thousands of poor Congolese people touching and breathing it day in and day out. Young mothers with babies strapped to their backs, all breathing in this toxic cobalt dust. These horrifying conditions are not contained to mining in the Congo either. China's lithium mining operations have drawn criticism for human rights violations as well, but the demand for lithium-ion batteries, a crucial component for the transition to renewable energy, outpaces the need to secure basic human rights. And it just becomes so obvious that the manufactured urgency to save humanity can be used to justify any level of inhumanity. And there are further issues with green energy initiatives where the reality of renewable solutions either fundamentally worsens the problem of ecological crisis or simply can't realistically produce enough energy to replace fossil fuels. According to Scientific American, simply converting the existing U.S. car fleet to battery-powered electric vehicles, for example, would require 3 times more lithium by 2050 than the world currently produces, according to new research from the University of California, Davis, and the Climate and Community Project. The world currently produces a little more than 100,000 tons of lithium a year. Under the best-case scenario the researchers established, the United States alone would require 306,000 tons a year by 2050. Lithium is extracted through a process called brine mining, which involves pumping salt water to the surface, where it is evaporated to remove the lithium and other minerals. Unfortunately, these toxic metals can contaminate water sources, threatening not only humans, but also animal biodiversity. Additionally, some of the metals contained in EV batteries are highly damaging even in small quantities. Since most are disposed of in landfills, leaks of environmental contaminants are frequent and can lead to underground fires, releasing even more pollutants into the atmosphere. When particles of hazardous metals contained in batteries like arsenic, cadmium, chromium, cobalt, and copper end up in the air and being breathed by humans and animals, they can cause a multitude of health problems. Likewise, the environmental costs of cobalt mining are also substantial. In the southern regions of the DRC where cobalt is mined, there are also large amounts of uranium, which has resulted in high radioactivity levels. In addition, mineral mining produces pollution that leaches into neighboring rivers and water sources, and dust from pulverized rock causes respiratory problems for local communities. All of this in addition, of course, to the typical ecological devastation caused by strip mining in general. The future of cobalt mining, though, isn't in strip mining on land, but rather in extracting cobalt from the seafloor where it exists in much greater quantity. The process is essentially like strip mining, except it is performed with giant vacuums which suck up the ocean bed for processing and destroy the very delicate ecosystems which occupy it. We have barely begun studying ocean life in earnest, and here we are rushing to disrupt and destroy it. Who knows what kind of potential downstream effects this ecological devastation will wreak. What's ironic is that all of the fervor of the push for renewable energy stems from the perceived urgency of the climate crisis, which is largely taken for granted as a self-evident reality at this point. But instead of the most important crisis of our time, which requires the most radical changes to human life, receiving the most dutiful of scientific inquiries, it has been subject to the most emotional, irrational, and performative kind of cultist obsession. Climate true believers demand the world grind to a sudden, deindustrialized halt, cause incalculable ecological, economical, and cultural damage, while refusing to participate in anything resembling rational debate or scientific rigor. When it comes to projecting the effects of climate change on the future, for example, we're presented with certain statements to take as hard fact, which are rarely explained in context, and then a great deal of importance and discussion is had around these somewhat arbitrary bits of data that we've sort of roughly all agreed means something important. And of course, natural disasters like wildfires and hurricanes and so on raise our alarms because they seem unusually intense from our point of view. When we combine our general anxiety about the damage humans cause the world with ominous-sounding science that's too complicated and too poorly explained to fully comprehend, there's a very real opportunity for us to be taken advantage of. And regardless of how you feel about so-called climate science, that vulnerability is worth taking an honest look at. It's not that I don't think that humans are damaging the Earth. I absolutely do, and have been an eco-crusader for longer than the climate crisis conversation has captured global attention. But I always assume that where people are deeply invested, they also tend to be emotional, and that means someone will try to take advantage of their vulnerability. This always happens. You just have to know how to look for it. Making sense of the climate, or as I prefer to think about it, ecological crisis, is far too deep of a subject to sort out in this episode. But it's all too easy to poke some holes in the so-called science that's presented. Instead of a deep dive, I'll just demonstrate the sorts of manipulation that suggests that the climate crisis camp has their thumb on the scale when it comes to the importance of carbon, fixating on profits in the carbon credit industry rather than addressing the underlying ecological issues. One small example of how climate data easily becomes biased is in the temperature readings themselves. It's not remotely feasible to measure the temperature in enough different locations around the globe to adequately represent the totality of Earth's bioregions. So instead, the temperatures are tracked in convenient locations to estimate the rising or falling temperatures and extrapolate that across the globe. This, in itself, is prone to miscalculation, honestly or otherwise. A paper in 2010 entitled A Critical Review of Global Surface Temperature Data Products asserts that the GHCN, or Global Historical Climatology Network, is the means by which global temperatures are gathered, and there are fundamental issues with its sources which contribute to overestimating the rise in temperatures. Specifically, the report says, the collapse in sample size has increased the relative fraction of data coming from airports to about 50%, up from about 30% in the 1970s. It has also reduced the average latitude of source data and removed relatively more high-altitude monitoring sites. Likewise, oceanic coverage has improved partly due to the deployment of buoys, as well as use of satellites to support extrapolation. And the quality of data over land, namely the raw temperature data in GHCN, depends on the validity of adjustments for known problems due to urbanization and land use change. The adequacy of these adjustments has been tested in 3 different ways, with 2 of the 3 finding evidence that they do not suffice to remove warming biases. The overall conclusion of the report is that there are serious quality problems in the surface temperature datasets that call into question whether the global temperature history, especially over land, can be considered both continuous and precise. So temperature data collection is challenging, and the data biased by virtue of how it must be collected, skewing warmer by tracking urban environments or the open sea at lower altitudes. Rather than a topic of absolute precision, there are a lot of assumptions which must be accepted before the basic idea can even be considered. But why should this matter? If the Earth is warming at all, should we not be concerned? Well, maybe not, because the most obvious and cheapest shot to take at the climate crisis camp is that they have been steadily wrong about their predictions and alarmism for decades. Tony Heller from realclimatescience.com has documented literally hundreds of examples of such inaccurate predictions and false claims of record high temperatures. And this isn't just picking apart the sensible argument to slow down fossil fuel consumption. In that, you'll get no argument from me. But there is a very big difference between trying to reduce oil drilling and gas consumption and restricting the right to free movement, demanding the slaughter of millions of cattle and forcing net zero standards on the population. Such a dramatic shift in the way that we live should be considered from all angles, not just the ones that support shiny new industries and investment opportunities. Net zero is more about carbon credits than carbon sequestration, and more about sequestration than positively impacting the environment. Carbon credits represent significant profits from very low-intensity land management, and it's a growing opportunity. A report on Australia's carbon neutrality program from February of this year, entitled Why Offsets Are Not a Viable Alternative to Cutting Emissions, commissioned by the Solutions for Climate Australia and the Australian Conservation Foundation, highlights universal problems with the carbon offsetting schemes used to reach net zero pledges that demonstrate the corruption and unviability of the carbon credit system. The report reads, a critical issue overlooked in Australia is the need for offset permanence, so that even if an offset over 25 or 100 years perfectly offsets the CO2 climate effect of fossil CO2 emissions, there is no requirement that stored carbon be held longer than the 25 or 100 years established by the Clean Energy Regulator. There is also no requirement to replace carbon from these projects should they be subsequently lost after this permanence period. This means that if after the end of the permanence period set under the Australian regulatory system, when carbon is ultimately lost, as is likely over longer timeframes, the atmospheric CO2 concentration would be higher than if the offset scheme had not been used in the first place, and an emission reduction was made at its source instead. Not only can we assume that no one will remember to solve this problem if we kick the can down the road in this way, but also, if we convince ourselves we're actually solving the problem when we're not, then we'll inevitably push the boundaries of the carbon sequestration system, increasing the climate crisis in the end, if the science is to be believed. A whistleblower already came forward in 2022 to identify massive corruption in the carbon offsetting industry, which sells carbon credits. According to The Guardian reporting on the story, the whistleblower described, the growing carbon market overseen by the government and the Clean Energy Regulator was largely a sham, as most of the carbon credits approved did not represent real or new cuts in greenhouse gas emissions. People are getting credits for clearing forests that were never going to be cleared. They're getting credits for growing trees that are already there. They're getting credits for growing forests in places that will never sustain permanent forests. And they are getting credits for operating electricity generators at large landfills that would have operated anyway. So the world is being forced to deindustrialize on the questionable premise of catastrophic, anthropogenic, meaning human-made, climate change, without any real guarantees of a successful outcome, based entirely on a system of carbon offset schemes which have already proven corrupt and ineffective. This is not science. This is simply a case of greedy oligarchs using shoddy studies to justify totalitarianism. The weapons of the hegemony have always been information control, i.e., controlling the narrative, demonization, and violence. The three methods work together to enforce authoritarianism. By controlling the narrative, you can demonize any dissenters and incite violence to keep the minority of dissenters in check. Today, this takes the shape of digital censorship, cancel culture, and policing. People have been trained and corralled into dependence on digital platforms to communicate and interact with each other, which has placed all of public discourse within a hidden system of technocratic control. Quietly over the last few years, and particularly since around the 2016 election, the U.S. government has invested heavily into the development of a secretive network of counter-disinformation institutions, by their own description, which actually form the misinformation industrial complex, expressly to control the flow of information and public perception by secretly infiltrating and coercing the U.S. tech industry to spy on, censor, and suppress the First Amendment rights of U.S. citizens. This is all done in the name of science, of course, with lots of studies justifying the need for unconstitutional and flagrantly anti-democratic measures to preserve democracy, public health, and national security. Investigative journalists Matt Taibbi, Barry Weiss, and Michael Schellenberger and others were invited by new Twitter CEO Elon Musk to reveal the government's ties to Twitter and the rest of the U.S. tech industry through a Twitter-only release called The Twitter Files. Of the many bombshell revelations, the most sobering among them was that the government to this day runs a coordinated domestic censorship campaign at a state and federal level that involves deep and direct ties between the national intelligence apparatus, the various OGAs, other government agencies such as the CIA, NSA, and so on, and the DHS, Department of Homeland Security, on the government side, and the tech industry, social media, video, search, etc. platforms. On the elected side of things, state and federal officials make reports and requests through the DHS, and on the institutional side of government, i.e. the deep state, intra-government agency requests filtered through the FBI. All of this is piped to Twitter, Facebook, and the rest of the tech industry through Slack channels, emails, and other digital means. At Twitter, the internal process was that the Trust and Safety Department, at the time headed by Yoel Roth, would respond to the requests by investigating, turning over data, suppressing, and banning any implicated accounts. Most of the time, this was just done on demand, and even the few publicly visible situations like the banning of former President Donald Trump, for example, were eventually fulfilled due to direct and documented pressure from the new White House administration. This has been widely denied by the U.S. government, and its typical mouthpieces within the mainstream media have maligned Taibbi with inaccurate and outright false reporting, as well as he has been targeted and pressured by various government agencies, such as the IRS, in obvious retaliation. A pattern should be emerging from all of these facts, that wherever science becomes commercialized, it also becomes corrupted, shaping the public narrative to create prestige, to gain approvals and funding, to take products to market, to empower the state and assert control, and so on. Science for sale carries very serious risks with it and has already carried a substantial human cost, and a cost to liberty and freedom of choice. But is it merely greed and ambition that have ruined modern science? No, though those impulses certainly whet the ego's appetite. The real motivation, or at least the justification, is that humanity's future is perpetually at stake, and only our science and technology can save us. Everyone, particularly in the West, grows up with stories patterned after the hero's journey, and therefore everyone wants to be the hero. Everyone wants to save the day, and when you believe that you're destined for heroism, you can't help but see crisis everywhere. Enter the polycrisis, which the World Economic Forum feverishly describes as present and future risks interacting with each other form a polycrisis, a cluster of related global risks with compounding effects, such that the overall impact exceeds the sum of each part. In the WEF's list of potentially contributing crises is included cost of living, natural disasters, unmitigated climate change, war, biodiversity, societal polarization, large-scale involuntary migration, and other individual problems which could combine into a larger meta-problem, a polycrisis. The inescapably dystopian future that the materialist-rationalist framework of mind inevitably produces is born out of the fear of death, which is then projected externally as the existential crisis of the survival of humanity. Our fears, combined with an insufferable savior complex, causes a human mind to justify increasingly dark extremes in the pursuit of actual or symbolic immortality. Assured of humanity's eventual self-destruction, any tragedy we experience in the short term becomes a necessary evil, a required step towards refining our perfect future selves. Short-term consequences be damned. And in performing that mental backflip, we begin to slide down the slippery slope from science to the self-righteous dogma that results in public figures spouting anti-scientific nonsense and calling it empirical truth. This brings us to the absolutely insane conditions of the 2020 to 2023 pandemic, when this quasi-religious and only barely even pseudo-scientific dogma started to flow unabashedly from the mouths of public officials. We were told to trust the science, that the science is settled, and moreover that they, the public officials, own the science, or more ambitiously, as the singularly arrogant Dr. Anthony Fauci claims, he is the science. What any of this actually means is beside the point. It is simply designed to assert their dominance, their central authority over interpreting scientific data, attempting to deny the average person, any non-experts, the right to disagree with the reality presented by these entirely political personalities, few of whom actually do any real science. Despite the protestations of these anti-science, aspirational totalitarians, there are a mountain of unexamined scientific realities, of Fortean damned facts which do not fit into the prevailing worldview, and are thus verboten to discuss. To nail the coffin lid shut on the toxified corpse of modern science, sealing it in its putrefaction so that it can't seep out and poison us again, let's review some samples of so-called settled science. Selling carbon credits will prevent climate change and save the planet. mRNA vaccines are safe and effective. EMF radiation is harmless. Misinformation is a literal pandemic. Meat is unhealthy, but bugs are not. Glyphosate isn't carcinogenic or neurotoxic. GMO plants don't risk the stability of the entire global food chain. Cow farts are a leading cause of climate change. Prolonged mask wearing has no negative side effects. And exposure to sunlight has no effect on seasonal respiratory illnesses, and so on. Can we not all agree at this point that all of this nonsense is a bunch of malarkey? It's not that the practice of science, of scientific inquiry, is inherently good or bad, but that the application of science for commercial purposes is very fraught. More than anything, the takeaway here should be that it's not a good idea to trust any scientific data completely, including what I've presented here, but to leave room for new and updated truths, personal experience, and ancient wisdom. What we're presented with is an opportunity, and potentially a mandatory one, to reevaluate our practice of science and its obviously corrupt institutions, to stop just swallowing the narratives that are presented to us because someone tells us the science is settled. At the very least, we should try to investigate and understand the science to the best of our ability, and to always be willing to listen to dissenters with a cogent argument. We can assume that where there is money involved, there is corruption, and what we call science today is just a series of data points which may or may not have been manipulated to support a narrative that empowers the already powerful and enriches the already rich. What we fall for every time isn't the supposed irrefutability of science. We refute outdated science all the time. Instead, the gaffe is in returning to solutionism and hero worship when these impulses empower the hegemony to control us. The myths that describe our world keep us locked in a prison of the mind and spirit, and those who would control us have locked themselves in the same prison. Most of them justify their extremes as necessary because they simply can't dream of any futures other than dark and dystopian ones. Belief is incredibly powerful, without a counterweight to balance these hopeless, nihilistic impulses, and I mean that as literally self-annihilating. If we don't start dreaming better dreams, we will manifest all the worst of what materialism has to offer. A cold, dead universe, generally unsupportive of life, in a vast expanse of meaninglessness. We will believe our way into oblivion, and not because it will somehow call doomsday down upon us via the climate or even war. It will be our own technology that robs us of our humanity. That spark of ourselves that makes us really alive will be lost because we simply stop believing in it. There's nothing wrong with science as a practice, not real investigative science that seeks out truth for curiosity's sake. But there is a great deal wrong with science as a modern institution. The kind of science that can be settled and owned isn't really science at all, because science isn't sacred, inviolable knowledge. That's religion. Thank you for tuning in to episode 16, part 1 of the 2-part series, The Religion of Science. In this first half of the series, I took potshots at science, pulling the rug out from under accepted reality, where we pretend to know a great deal about the universe that we just inconveniently can't seem to empirically prove, and how our choice to have faith in science that we can't prove is less a rational choice than a spiritual one. In the next episode, I'm going to explore the idea of the religion of science further, tracing the ideas that led to our obsession with the future that pulls our attention away from the here and now, from real ways to address and adapt to our problems that preserve our sacred spark instead of sacrificing everything that it means to be human. I hope you'll tune in for that as well. In the meantime, know that I appreciate you giving me your attention and taking this wild ride with me. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe so that you'll get notified when the next episode is ready. And I've got a lot more content to offer, more episodes, videos, articles, and more on my website, www.postmugglism.com. And you can subscribe to my email newsletter there in the sidebar. Signing up for the newsletter means you'll get everything I publish for free right in your inbox, regardless of the platform that I put it on. I so very much appreciate the time that you spend with me and look forward to doing this again soon. Until then, take care, and may the gods be with you.